Coming to a theater near you, Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and joining us today is Brian Mackey with Illinois Public Radio. Brian, glad you're here.
Thanks, Jamey.
And Andy Maloney with the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Andy, welcome to the show.
Good to be back.
So kind of an obtuse teaser there, but there is a trailer out that some folks have picked up. I believe Capitol Facts and Politico both had early versions of it, of a movie that focuses on House Speaker Michael Madigan. Brian, tell us a little bit about who's making this movie and what the trailer is indicating to us so far.
An obtuse trailer about an obtuse man. So it's put out by a group, the trailer was put out at least by a group called Illinois Policy Action, which the Illinois Policy Institute, a conservative think tank down here. This is one of their affiliates or sister organizations, if you will. And this is about their ongoing sort of campaign, I think, in support of Governor Rauner's policies and trying to tar House Speaker Michael Madigan and stir up as much doubt among voters of this state as they possibly can. And they are looking to, Madigan's been around for a very long time, and that's something that the governor talks about quite a lot, and it's something that you hear a lot of conservatives and Republicans talking about. So this is, I think, part of a broader trend we've seen of political movies. Citizens United, the famous U.S. Supreme Court case, was about one such movie a number of years ago. Certainly when John Kerry was running for president, we saw that, and now with all the money sloshing around Illinois, we're seeing that apparently people have the resources to make a feature-length film about the Speaker of our House.
And this trailer, Andy, it's pretty flashy. It's pretty high quality compared to what we might see out of a political ad with, silly little pop-ups and that kind of thing. This is really pretty slick.
And they also have some big names if you pay attention to Illinois politics. You mentioned Capitol Facts. Rich Miller discussed today how he was interviewed for it, although maybe wasn't quite aware of who was behind it initially. Dick Simpson, a professor of political science, I believe. And just some other names who are kind of lending at least a little bit of their insight to this enterprise. But as Brian talked about, it really echoes the themes that Governor Rauner and Illinois Policy Action and their affiliates have kept on for quite some time now, talking about the Speaker being a career politician and being here for 40 years and kind of keeping his finger on the pulse of everything going on in Illinois government. I think there's a feeling that is still an effective message. It plays into the governor's push for term limits and redistricting and those types of things that we'll probably get into later. But it's kind of striking almost when you see the trailer. It does look very professional and ominous.
Yeah, and I just think it's important to keep in mind that this is business for them, right? This is what the Policy Institute has sort of made it their mission, it seems, in recent months or the past couple of years to support Governor Rauner and whatever he's doing. And this is just sort of like another piece of that campaign that they've done to try and push his agenda and his policies, which seem to be pretty closely tied to their own goals.
Well, and as you noted, Brian, this has been sort of a national trend for a pretty long time. We've seen movies like this made about the Clintons, about Barack Obama. Is something like this effective? Who's actually going to get out to the theater? They said probably a limited release of this, but to watch a documentary on a member of the Illinois General Assembly, albeit the most famous member of the Illinois General Assembly.
Right, and it'll be interesting to me to see what sort of theaters are actually picking this up. Do they have to rent movie theaters to get them to play it? Will AMC, a big international corporation, I think they're actually based out of China, now have to, will they be taking up this movie? Or will they have to sort of pay to have theaters that will show it? I guess by us sitting here talking about it now and talking about how they say the speaker is so terrible, we're helping to fulfill their mission, which is in part just to keep this idea in people's minds. Even if nobody sees the movie, they're certainly aware of it. And who knows if they, maybe they'll decide to run this commercial for this movie as sort of almost like it's not technically a political advertisement. Does it help them get around campaign finance laws? I'm just speculating here. We don't know anything about that yet, but the possibilities here and the kind of murky boundary between what is an entertainment or a work of journalism really, or what is a campaign advertisement? These are the questions that have been at the core of some of the legal battles we've had over campaign finance regulation in this country. So it's certainly going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
And something that the Policy Institute is kind of seeking to push the boundary on, right, Andy? I mean, they're getting involved in news and are seeking to expand their reach in journalism.
Yeah, it's not just, I would imagine that if this campaign is happening, or this kind of movement is happening 10 years ago or something, it takes a little bit of a different form. It almost reminds me a little bit of, if you remember during the session, there was a sort of competing march. There were some labor marches scheduled during a session day at the Capitol, and you sort of had this competing march that was supported and kind of advertised by the same folks. And so they're trying different ways to get their message out, whether it's buying a radio or lending sort of their news service, which kind of in line with their messaging, lending those types of news stories for free to other outlets. It's just a different approach than I think we're used to, although, as Brian correctly points out, making a movie is starting to become kind of the hot thing to do if you've got political ideals.
And a lot of money.
And a lot of money to burn. Very importantly, a lot of money.
Well, and of course, the Policy Institute always makes the point that these are all separate arms of the organization, that they're separate entities, that they don't work together according to the Policy Institute. Of course, there's really no way that we can check that out, Brian, because we can't really tell where the money is coming from for this, correct? I mean, we know the governor has made at least one large donation to the Policy Institute because that came out in the news, but this group doesn't have to let people know who's funding it.
Right, and because it's a nonprofit, it's not subject to the same rules that a political campaign. If a political committee was to have this sort of advertising, we would know instantly in the state of Illinois who is donating the money if it was over a certain threshold, or depending when on the election cycle it came. Political contributions are disclosed immediately. But in this world of, well, we're a nonprofit, we're set up for education, we're just educating people, we're not really trying to influence the political debate, you're able to mask who your donors are. So yeah, there's a lot of questions, and I think a lot of reporters I know are fairly skeptical of the Policy Institute, or certainly know when you see a Policy Institute report, you have a set of ideas about, well, they have an agenda that they're pushing, and I think that's true. The question is, as you pointed out, they bought Illinois Radio Network, which used to be an independent news service that fed commercial radio stations around Illinois, and they have for a long time had a press arm that kind of gives their stories away to newspapers that run them. And so the question is, do the readers of those papers, do the editors of those papers really have that same view when they're publishing these things? Do they approach it with that skepticism? I don't know. And
I think importantly, we could also point out that they've got the affiliated legal arm, the Liberty Justice Center, which has been discussed on this program before, but I mean, just a bullet point list of the topics that they've gotten involved in. A lawsuit against same-day registration, which was a bill that had Democratic support and was a big sort of part of, I think, immediately after Governor Quinn was defeated a couple years ago, getting that passed and getting that through while he was still in office. You have fair share fees, Liberty Justice Center involved in that as well. And then I think they spoke about it on a panel last week, the limits on campaign contributions from caucus committees, right? So it's not just a media battle, it's not just a sort of political ideas battle, they're also in the legal world as well.
Well, and Brian, to your point, I mean, I think not a day goes by that we as reporters don't get something in our inbox, or not many days, that purports to be a study or something along those lines that we do know is coming from an organization with a worldview or with a dog in the fight. They're not the only ones by any means, but is there something that sets them apart, or is it just the scope and the fact that the organization, some of the members of this group are very close to the governor.
I don't think there's and this group predates Bruce Rauner's involvement in Illinois politics, at least his big involvement now. He certainly supported Mayor Rahm Emanuel in the past, but really when he started running for governor, the Illinois Policy Institute's been around for more than 10 years now. What sets them apart is I don't think there is a similar group. They boast of having dozens of employees on their website, 50, 60, I don't remember the number off the top of my head. I don't think that there's either among liberals or progressives or labor unions, whatever other interest groups there are, I don't think they have nearly the horsepower or firepower, if you will, pulling in the same direction. I think it's also interesting that they really seem to be focused on what the governor's agenda is, right? If you look at, we have a stopgap budget right now in Illinois that is wildly out of balance. And you can usually count on the Policy Institute to be critical of bad budgeting decisions, but this is not something where they've chosen to make a stand against Governor Rauner, for example, for doing a wildly out of balance budget that's increasing the Illinois deficit and making our financial situation worse by the day. So it really does seem striking that they have really kind of locked onto his agenda as their own agenda, and where one begins and the other ends. There have even been reports. Rich Miller, we mentioned earlier, the Capital Facts newsletter writer and blogger, has reported that John Tillman, the head of the Policy Institute, is a very close advisor to the governor at this point. And so it certainly is a unique situation for Illinois. I think something that we'd gotten used to seeing nationally with these interest groups pushing agendas with sometimes murky funding sources, but it's certainly they are unique in Illinois.
Well, and Andy, Citizens United, which Brian just touched on, that plays a pretty big role in all of this being sort of confusing and difficult to follow at this point, right? As far as money that can pour into these groups without limits and without reporting.
Yeah, just overall you have a big kind of battle ongoing at that level of things with who can contribute and what should be disclosed. It's I think the general view of Citizens United is that it just made things more difficult to put your finger on. The campaign contribution limits, for corporations being unlimited, it kind of makes not just Illinois being sort of the Wild West of campaign finance, but everywhere is kind of in this territory where we don't know where exactly the money's coming from a lot of times. And so that makes a confusing political environment as the media landscape changes and different entities get involved in different ways, makes things harder to grasp for everybody.
Well, while we're on the topic of elections and money, I'd like to move on to talk a little bit more specifically about the governor. Folks have been asking him over the last few weeks how involved he's getting in state legislative races, and he has been saying not very much. That I'm focused on governing. I'm not really getting heavily involved in those races. But Brian, people have taken some issue with that, partially because he's just contributing so much money.
Right. I guess the question is, if somebody spends $16 million on something, the question people should ask themselves is, are you involved with it? Does spending $16 million on something make you involved with it? I spent considerably less than that on my car. It's my car. I'm pretty involved with it. I spent considerably less than that on my house. It's my house. I'm involved with it. The governor has spent $16 million to help Republicans get elected to the Illinois state legislature. And yet he says he's not involved and not really paying attention to the process. It's frankly a mind-boggling claim. It's one of those things where this is a new political reality. He's just spinning the facts, or he's just outright lying, and he's certainly not the only politician we have these questions about, but where it's just that you have the facts of he spent $16 million on this, and yet he says he's not involved. It's very difficult to wrap your brain around those two apparently contradictory pieces of evidence.
Yeah. Go ahead. I was going to just say, if you want to talk about Supreme Court case law and campaign contributions, if money is speech, which is sort of one of the tenets of a decision like Citizens United, then if you're speaking pretty loudly with $16 million in state legislative races, other people have made that connection. But I think it's a number that for most everybody is really hard to just even imagine, what that looks like. But to lay down that investment of your own fortune and then to say, well, I'm still generally hands off, takes it another step of being hard to comprehend.
And it also goes against other things we've seen about how various legislative seats have been filled. A number of them, the governor has seen fit to appoint to state jobs. Some of those, it seemed very early on, were a lot of potentially pro-union legislators. We saw Ray Poe here, former state representative, get a job with, I believe, the Department of Agriculture. He's the head of the Department of Agriculture, director. We saw
lifelong farming family. I mean,
right.
he did have.
It's not that it doesn't make sense, but
credentials for that.
Right. But Rich Brower, another Springfield area state representative, got a job, not the top job, but a job in the Department of Transportation. Wayne Rosenthal from, I think, the Decatur area vaguely, is head of the Department of Natural Resources. And I'm not saying that they weren't qualified for that job. That's not what I'm talking about. But it's interesting that, you had a good number of downstate Republicans who were fairly pro-union, had good relationships with AFSCME, the biggest union representing state government employees, and a lot of those people,
mostly because of the makeup of their constituency.
Right. This is who they represent. A lot of those people were plucked out of the legislature. One of them who wasn't is State Senator Sam McCann, and he actually chose to vote where he thought his constituents wanted him to. He voted in support of AFSCME on a bill that the governor really opposed. And the governor went all out to try and defeat him and failed in the primary. So this is an example where what I was getting to is that each of these people have left the legislature, and from what other people have reported, the governor has had a very heavy hand in helping to select their replacements, the people who have gotten appointed to fill those vacancies and are now running for election in their own right for the first time this fall.
Well, we're seeing that play out now with the replacement of State Senator Matt Murphy, who moved on to work for a lobbying firm. Andy, we were hearing the governor, is pretty involved in maybe sitting down with potential candidates or sending surrogates to sit down with potential candidates for that appointment.
Right, yeah. The Daily Herald, I believe, reported that, after initially saying that he was going to be hands-off and the local party leaders were going to pick Senator Murphy's replacement, we saw reports that the governor was sitting down with, I think John Tillman was one of the reported names, and Christine Radonio, the Senate Minority Leader for the Republican Party, to kind of vet the candidates. I think he said maybe part of the phrasing has been, I'm not involved in sort of the day-to-day activities of managing who gets appointed to those seats, but if you're vetting candidates, it begs the question, what is sort of the definition of a day-to-day activity in terms of helping replace those candidates? So interviewing candidates and again, going back to the amount of money that has been poured into winning legislative seats, there seems to be a heavy hand in it.
And our friend and our colleague Amanda Vinicky had, I thought, a really good point on this in a story this week where she said, Rauner became an extremely wealthy man. He's worth hundreds of millions of dollars by carefully monitoring his investments, right? That was his main job. And so it just raises the question, is it plausible that, as he says now, that he has invested $16 million, which admittedly is less than, it's a little more than a quarter of his annual income in the last couple of years based on his investment income that he gets and has disclosed through a sort of a tax summary form that he's published. Is he now not paying attention to what his money is being invested in? And I guess that's something that people will just have to make their own judgment about.
Well, and Andy, while a lot of reporters are finding these statements a little confounding, why might the governor be wanting to get this message out there that he is not, heavily involved in these campaigns?
I guess one reason you could argue is, the person that he's spent so long demonizing, Speaker Madigan, kind of has that reputation for being heavy-handed and controlling and a lot of these same facets. The head of the Democratic Party, right, exactly. So I suspect that could be one reason. He also, I think in general, when he goes on the stump and he talks about things like redistricting and term limits, wants to be somebody who's seen as kind of a big picture person. And when you get involved in the micro level of managing these races and other types of activities that are similar to that, you kind of lose a little bit of that appeal. You lose a little bit of that outsider sheen, if you will, that was so successful for him 2 years ago when he ran for the office, and which he has maintained throughout the first couple of years as governor. So those are a couple reasons. Other reasons may be internal. If some other seat opens up and he doesn't have, for whatever reason, interest in a particular candidate or filling that particular seat, maybe he backs off a little bit. But any of those reasons could be possibilities.
I think going to one thing you said too, you can't underestimate how deeply unpopular he is among certain people in this state, particularly a lot of state employees. If you're a union member of AFSCME, statewide, it's not enough to sway the election one way or the other, as we saw. Obviously, AFSCME spent a lot of money and effort trying to not get him not elected, both in the primary and general election, and failed at that. However, there are parts of the state, Springfield being one, other could be districts that have more than one prison in them, where there's a lot of state government union members, and having the governor be associated with your candidate could make you deeply unpopular in those areas. So I think the governor probably has an eye on his own sinking approval ratings in certain parts of the state.
And you did mention Sam McCann, that race, him getting involved at the primary level with, I think it was Bryce Benton was the name. And Bryce Benton, of course, was the candidate that the governor endorsed, ended up losing. Sam McCann is obviously still in the legislature. So perhaps something of a test balloon or something to see.
Small sample size.
Yes, it has some sample size
But
issues.
a little harder to tally up something as a loss in maybe a proxy fight between the governor and the speaker if the governor is saying, well, I wasn't really that involved to begin with.
Yeah, very true.
And I think that's another good point, because I think that Republicans are bracing themselves. This is a year where presidential election years typically favor Democrats in Illinois, because you have, the last two presidential election years, you had Barack Obama on the ballot. He's a son of Chicago. There was a lot of excitement for him. That helped Democrats in Illinois. And I think that a lot of people have viewed Trump's unpopularity among some voters as potentially being a drag on down-ticket Republicans. And so maybe Republicans are sort of hedging their bets just in case they don't do well this year. Then they can try and spin the narrative to say, well, it's not that Governor Rauner's policies are unpopular, it's that Donald Trump was so unpopular, that's why we lost. And so when they can come back in 2 years, the governor, presumably, I believe he said he's running for re-election, and can try and do it again and try and cut into the House and Senate Democratic majorities one more time.
Well, I want to shift gears now to talk a little bit about redistricting. I know we've been talking about it on the show quite a bit over the last few weeks, but Andy, the group that was pushing for the Citizens Initiative to get it on the ballot had kind of their last hope dissolve. Can you tell me a little bit about what happened? Right.
So the group Support Independent Maps, or Independent Maps, obviously calling for an amendment to wrest the map-making powers from legislators, where it currently is. Had already lost a decision at the Illinois Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a party line ruling, said it's too broad, it doesn't fit within the narrow parameters of what's a constitutional citizens amendment. And so they filed, which is a pretty sort of formality, as Brian I know can talk to as well, a petition for rehearing. Supreme Court rarely grants it. It's basically saying, well, we think you didn't get the decision right. Here's why. Could you please look at it again? My research indicates that they haven't granted one of those in 10 years, I don't think. So it's something that gets filed in a lot of cases, rarely gets granted. And so it wasn't surprising when this week the Supreme Court denied that petition. However, it was another opportunity for the group to come out and say, well, now that's, the court has sided with vested interests, and the governor gave him another chance to come out and say, I'm calling on the General Assembly to take this back up again when they reconvene in the fall, and kind of stick to that talking point, but finally shift gears away from the court, at least for now.
Well, and Brian, this is the second attempt to try to get something like this on the ballot. Some of the folks with this group sort of indicated that this move was also to maybe try to get a little bit more direction from the court as to what they could draft that might be acceptable? I mean, might that have been part of the strategy here, or?
I think, that's what they say their strategy was. Please give us some guidance, is what they asked for the Supreme Court. But I'm going to go back to my constitutional law professor in my undergrad, who used to say, he had this way of speaking where he'd say, dicta, dicta. Anything in a court opinion that is not necessary to resolving the issue that's before the court is considered dicta. It's superfluous. And courts and judges, particularly big courts like Supreme Courts, try to avoid saying more than they have to. That's kind of a principle of law. And so it's not surprising to me that the court would say, well, you did this one little thing wrong, and we're not in the business of issuing advisory opinions. We only rule on the legal issues we have to resolve the case. And obviously the group would love for the court to just kind of get a cocktail napkin out and draw a little diagram and a map and some arrows and say, do this, don't do that. But it's not surprising to me that the court chose not to go down that route. It's worth noting, perhaps, that the three justices in the minority, and Andy can speak to this a little better, perhaps thought that maybe the court should have done that and maybe even tried to do that in their dissents.
They indicated with this denial this week that they will have some additional thoughts on the denial of this proposed amendment. I'll say that is pretty unusual, at least in my time covering the court, for the court to deny the hearing but then say, well, we're going to modify, we're going to add some new material to the opinion, to the things that we've already said. Of course, you had the three Republican justices who were pretty strongly against what the majority did, which is rule on one issue involving the Auditor General's office, to say that it was unconstitutional and wouldn't work. But you had some pretty strong language in those initial dissents. Will be interesting to see what they do in the future dissents.
And I'm sorry, Brian, we're going to have to leave it at that for this week, but I'm sure we will be revisiting redistricting again in the future on the show. I'd like to thank my guests, Brian Mackey and Andy Maloney. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.